Packageability can be a critical component of a well-architected solution. So if you're designing a composable solution where you've got clear separation of concerns, if you use multiple packages, you can actually align those packages with some of those boundaries. And that way, the intent of your application architecture is better translated into what actually gets built. And then those boundaries can help enforce your design long after it's out of your hands and into the hands of your engineers.
Hello, everyone. I'm here with Vivek Chawla, who is a principal ISV Platform Expert at Salesforce. Today, we are going to focus our conversation on how customers and ISVs can help make their solutions more packageable through loose coupling and dependency management. Why should architects, whether they work at an ISV or whether they work at a customer, why should they care about packageability today?
Great question. So, first off, as we talk about packaging and packageability today, I want to be very clear that I'm referring only to second generation packaging, or 2GP. So all net new packages, whether you're building them as a customer, building them as a partner, all these packages should be built using 2GP.
And Vivek, now, I've heard you talk about like the difference. So for maybe someone coming out like high level, what's that difference between 1GP and 2GP?
First generation packaging is an org-driven technology. You actually have to have a packaging org. You make changes in the org, you click a button and it uploads a package. And so this org-centric model kind of is the hallmark of 1GP. Second generation packaging, it's a source-driven packaging model. There is no packaging org. If you're a partner and you're building a managed package for the App Exchange, you'd have a namespace. So you'd have a namespace org, and then you can build multiple packages that use the same namespace. Whereas first generation packaging, you can't. And with this source-driven model, you use the Salesforce CLI to actually create a package, and you can then move those packages around and deploy them with the CLI. So it takes this very, kind of old and static technology, org-driven technology, and brings it into the modern era of developer experience.
From an architect's point of view, it's also following some great best practices, right? And well-architected, we're recommending not using org-based development anymore, and instead moving towards source-based development, because source-based development and using packages is just more stable.
Packageability can be a critical component of a well-architected solution. So if you're designing a composable solution where you've got clear separation of concerns, if you use multiple packages, you can actually align those packages with some of those boundaries. And that way, the intent of your application architecture is better translated into what actually gets built. And then those boundaries can help enforce your design long after it's out of your hands and into the hands of your engineers.
What is the biggest blocker that you've seen when folks actually sit down and they're like, okay, we're bought in, we get the concept, we know why we should be moving towards this paradigm, but what happens when the rubber actually meets the road?
Second generation packaging really requires that you have a commitment to a Salesforce DX workflow. And what I mean by an SFDX workflow is that you're using source-driven development, you're using the Salesforce CLI, and if an engineering team is not quite there yet, because, as you said, we're recommending that folks move away from org-based development, entirely. But if you're not there, it can be a hurdle initially to get your team, over that hump. Now, I would argue that the benefits of having a source-driven workflow are going to far outweigh the startup cost. But I understand the anxiety that can cause, kind of making that first step. Okay, so with the DevOps stuff out of the way, the biggest hurdle, and this is especially true for customers, and extremely true for customers with mature orgs, is how overwhelmingly complicated it can be to figure out how to untangle what we commonly refer to as the happy soup. Mm-hmm. All of those benefits that we just talked about a few minutes ago are, like separation of concerns and having the package boundaries reflect your application architecture. All of that's only going to be possible if you know where you want to segment your metadata and then how you can make that happen. Because if you've got a mature org with years of technical debt, where everyone's kind of, I've been there. I've been a customer. You're in a rush to get something out for a particular release, and somebody from a different team throws a change on, and it's breaking everything. And so you can make ad hoc changes on top of ad hoc changes, and years of that can lead to really, really interdependent code where you don't know where to start breaking it up. This is the biggest challenge for customers, I think.
Definitely. So if customer architects are working on these really like gnarly implementations, where should they start untangling dependencies?
Ideally, you would start untangling dependencies, by identifying the most commonly used, parts of an app and seeing if you can, maybe pull all of that out to have sort of a base package or a core package, maybe, and build some dependencies off of that. The challenge is that depending on what engineering teams are actually available to make those changes, you might have to make changes that are more aligned with the teams you have available versus what's actually best, from a packaging strategy standpoint. And the important thing is it's really a journey, and it's something where one size doesn't fit all. But I would really recommend trying to identify commonly used pieces of code, trying to identify features, or see if there are aspects that might align with different business units, so that you could start to build areas of responsibility with different teams, and then see if you can separate the code that way.
Definitely. Yeah. I think we, at a theoretical level, at least in Well Architected, we talk a lot about grouping by business capability. So making sure that you have that, you're not letting the development teams necessarily guide how you're making these really long lasting choices about how you're going to package stuff up, making sure that that's you get the engineering resources in place. Like you said, that's obviously a dependency from a staffing perspective, but you want to group your metadata based on those business capabilities.
Agreed. And this is where moving from happy soup to packaging can be a really big challenge. And it's one that's not, I would love it if we could solve it just by making a lot of great boxes on the screen. If we could do all of this in a diagram, that would be great. But I like this idea of you have to start somewhere. You have to start where you ideally want to go. And you're right, you shouldn't base your architecture exclusively on the resources that are there. But I think it's important to take into account the resources that are available. If nothing else, maybe in determining how, what order you might go about, breaking out dependencies and breaking out features.
Definitely. And would you say that starting with, we obviously need to understand the dependencies, but would you start with maybe a new functionality that you're introducing to start packaging, or would you go from like the most common objects that have a lot of dependencies? How would you attack that?
I think there's more opportunity to do challenging things when you're doing something new. And so you can kind of dip your toes into a packageable approach, with new features, new metadata. Having said that, if it's very, very clear what your base set of metadata is, if you have a very specific set of core objects, if you have a very specific set of core functionality, maybe you've already done some great work in your org, and you've built out separation of concerns, and you can identify, oh, you know what, here's a collection of classes that really acts as a service layer. Maybe you can kind of build out your data layer, service layer, and then build new things on top of that. So but as you're doing that, the lower you get on the stack, the more challenging it can be, and the more teams you have to get involved, to make sure everyone is moving forward with the new architecture. So if you're dipping your toe into packaging, start on the outside and just get your team comfortable with that, and that might actually make the harder work of doing the deeper levels a little bit easier.
That makes sense. And we've talked now a little bit, we've mentioned separation of concerns a few times. So why don't we just unpack that for folks watching? What exactly is separation of concerns and why is it important?
Sure. So separation of concerns is an architectural pattern where you're separating out different areas of work, separating out, say you have a layer of your data model, and then rather than having code that you're building out a feature with access the data directly, you can instead access that data through different data access classes. If you have a data layer on top of the data itself, or data access layer, or maybe your kind of higher level functional code, maybe it's not accessing your data access layer. Maybe you're thinking about your app in terms of services. And so you could actually build a layer of service classes that consume the data classes that consume the data layer. And then this way, because you're building out this architecture where a change at the data layer isn't necessarily immediately going to impact the code at the top, some functional code that's calling it, because the functional code is functioning because it's calling classes and methods at the service layer. You've got a lot of flexibility in each layer to implement changes, fixes, and improve performance, things like that, without negatively impacting everyone else, as long as you keep consistent APIs. And so that kind of separation of concerns can lead to code that's more flexible, more maintainable, and especially if you start to think of each layer as having its own version and its own release cycle. And then your teams can build each layer out so it has the capabilities that are required by those who consume it. This lets you have teams that have kind of more focused, more focused work and more focused areas of expertise, and again, it can lead to code that over time is more stable and more scalable.
In your opinion, should all implementations be using a packaging approach, even if, say, it's a very small team?
Great question. I think regardless of team size, if you're on a brand new project and a greenfield implementation, there's no reason not to use packages. You should always be using packages. If you're a small team and you've got a mature org, I understand where it can be more difficult, and that's why I liked earlier how you had mentioned kind of taking nibbles at things on the outside when working in. So I think that packaging can be used by teams of any size, and it should always be used if it's brand new. Or if you're doing a brand new implementation, but I'm really trying to think of when you wouldn't use packaging. Maybe that's a better way to look at it. And it's I think if you're going in to make a small change in a mature org and people just want to get something fixed real fast, that's not the time to say, okay, let's put everything on hold and figure out how to do this as a package-based solution. But outside of that, I think that every team can make steps towards getting to a package-driven Nirvana, and it should always be something that teams are thinking about.
Definitely. And I think, again, that aligns really well with well-architected guidance, which is, even if you're not going to use packages, like the actual function in Salesforce, and use it with DX, having a packaging mindset and thinking about the metadata that you create in different functional units, I think is something that we're recommending that everyone do, even if they're maybe not ready to pull the trigger on, changing the way they deploy their changes.
That's a great point. I think that there are many customers who, even for years, when our packaging technology maybe wasn't great for customers, right? They would still build out they would try to build out their metadata in ways where they're following separation of concerns. Andy Fawcett, has been writing about, amazing enterprise application architecture on Salesforce using separation of concerns years before, unlocked packages and second generation packaging made it easier to do.
Yes.
So yeah, I like how you talked about a packaging mindset, because even if you're not actually packaging anything, as long as you're starting to think about your solution in
internal APIs, that's something we mentioned in well-architected, but I don't think we have great examples of. Like, what's an example of that concept?
The best example is actually for how can I build in for partners? How can I build my solution ISVs? If you were building the concept of maybe APIs and even internal packages before, the only way to reuse Apex code across package boundaries was to expose global methods. And now global Apex it can't never be changed. Essentially, if you're building an API for your internal code, anybody can call it. Somebody could, spin up an anonymous Apex window and actually call your global methods. And so second gen packaging and this ability to have namespaced accessible Apex,
yes,
meaning that if you have packages that use a namespace, and namespaces, you don't have to be a partner to use namespaces. Customers can use namespaces. It allows you to build truly internal APIs that only other packages can call. And the simple fact of having that as a technical option allows you to start thinking as an application architect in terms of APIs that only other parts of my solution are going to call, without fear that, okay, if I expose something, then somebody down the road, or a curious admin is going to use this and break something,
right?
And so that's what I mean from a technical level. But really, it's internal APIs. It's really more of a mindset of, okay, I'm going to build something in my solution that other people or other teams who are also building parts of this solution are going to be able to trust. I'm going to essentially have a contract with them. So even if I have the ability to change my method signatures, I'm not going to, because I have a contract with the consumers of this API. So it's a mindset that has you building solutions with the express idea that someone else is going to reuse this and needs to trust that what I'm saying in terms of my interface is what I'm going to be, 6 months, a year, 2 years down the line.
Maybe folks have tried packaging before, but they've run into some blockers. Why should they go back now and give it another go? Like, what about the tooling has changed?
Org-dependent packages, can allow you to build packages now that you couldn't have built, a few years ago. So that's a big thing. Our tooling is always also getting better. We have the new unified Salesforce CLI, which, I think some of the new commands are a little bit friendlier. There's amazing ability to use what we call source deployment, like source push and source pull. So source tracking, which was something when Salesforce DX first came out, was only available with Scratch orgs. Now you can do source tracking against sandbox orgs. So I feel like our tooling has come much closer to the place where customer developers have been, and I think that if you kind of gave all of this a shot a few years ago and it just didn't seem too hard, it wasn't working, come back and give it a try again, because I think there are a few things that have made it a lot easier for you.
Thank you so much for your time, Vivek. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, Susanna.